One of the key judgments in this area is that of Lord Bridge giving the leading speech in Lloyd's Bank against Rossett. Lord Bridge says there are two ways in which you can acquire rights in the home in situations where you're not married. First, if there is some agreement, arrangement or understanding between the parties, entered into usually before the acquisition of the house, as to the interest they're going to have in the house, and providing that anyone who is claiming such a right has also suffered some detriment. So what that means, if we put Lord Bridge in deciding the case between these two litigants, is that Claire will get nothing because Claire hasn't contributed. Because there is no agreement, arrangement or understanding between the parties. Remember, they bought the house without discussing it. Lord Bridge then says there is a second way in which you can acquire rights in the house by way of conduct. The only conduct which counts, as far as Lord Bridge is concerned, is if you have contributed to the purchase price or to the mortgage instalments. It's at least extremely doubtful whether anything less will do, unquote. Claire hasn't contributed to the purchase price, nor has she contributed to the mortgage instalments. Instead, she's been paying for medical care for their child. Instead, it's her partner, who, if I'm being honest, I've forgotten his name. It's her partner who has made all of the mortgage repayments. So if we apply Lord Bridge's test strictly, he gets the entirety of the house and she gets nothing. So if we're acting as a barrister for him, we're going to seek to rely on Lord Bridge's speech in Lloyd's Bank and Rossett. There are different judicial approaches. There has been another House of Lords case, Stack and Dowden. We'll come to that in later vidcasts. Instead, there's a decision of a judge called Lord Justice Waite in Midland Bank and Cook. This isn't actually what Lord Justice Waite looks like. To be perfectly honest with you, I haven't been able to find a photograph of him. So let's just assume he has a Prince of Spain beard, fantastic sideburns and funky glasses. And he's also smiley. Lord Justice Waite's approach in Midland Bank against Cook was to say, we should undertake a survey of the whole course of dealing between the parties. You see, for Lord Justice Waite, he wants us to take into account everything. Whereas, if you're Lord Bridge, you would take the view that there were lots and lots of contributions to an ordinary family life which simply didn't acquire one any rights in the property at all. So, for example, paying bills, supervising building work wouldn't count. Whereas for Lord Justice Waite, we must undertake a survey of the whole course of dealing, which would mean that Claire's contribution to the medical costs of caring for their small child could be taken into account as part of the whole course of dealing between the parties, and in consequence, Claire could be taken to have some equitable interest in the property after all, even though Lord Bridge would have held something very different. So what we have here are just competing judicial approaches, and if we were acting as barrister for Claire, our approach would be to try and rely on Lord Justice Waite in court. Now, Lord Justice Waite's approach has been much more popular with, for example, Lord Justice Chadwick in Oxley and Hiscock, and suggestions from Baroness Hale and the other judges in the House of Lords, the majority in the House of Lords anyway, in Stack and Dowden, suggesting that that's more likely the route that's going to be followed, this undertaking a survey of the whole course of dealing. The only point we're trying to make now is that we have to understand two things. How people's relationships really begin and function in these cases. It's not about beautiful castles in the English countryside. It's not about kings and queens and beautiful weddings. Instead, it's about parties, it's about relationships breaking down, people getting together accidentally, and then suddenly having small blue Smurf children. And that we have competing judicial approaches. If you read these speeches from Lord Bridge and the judgment of Lord Justice Waite, you cannot, I would suggest, reconcile those two judgments. Clearly their approach to how the law should function in this area is very, very different. So what we're doing is we're taking these real world problems from these ordinary human beings, broken relationships, small blue Smurf children, and we're taking them into these courtrooms. into these judges who appear to be talking about legal principle but actually disagreeing with one another. And that's absolutely key to understanding how English law functions generally. Any common law system is not going to be built on straightforward, hard and fast rules. It's going to be built on different judges taking different approaches to similar questions, and yet annoyingly purporting to follow often the same principles and the same rules. But as an example, these two judges, even though in fact their photographs are very, very similar, are taking very, very different approaches to the same real-world situation. And how like life? We mustn't expect too much logic from life. We mustn't expect too much logic, it seems, even from the judges. Instead, they're going to be competing trends of thought, competing approaches to the principles. So what I suggest you do, dear student, is to put yourself in the place of a barrister and consider which of the litigants would wish to follow which judge. He would want to follow Lord Bridge in this example, and she would want to follow Lord Justice Waite. And then consider what the arguments are for and against. And also, importantly, consider, ultimately, which one of these judges must hold sway. Lord Justice Waite in the Court of Appeal, necessarily junior to Lord Bridge in the House of Lords. But interestingly then, why is Lord Justice Waite able to get away with this? Not following the precedent as he's supposed to do. And that is one of the eternal questions of common law. So in later vidcasts we're going to work through these people's scenarios in greater detail and consider one by one how each of the various judicial approaches would consider this. So if you go to the website alistairhudson.com, you'll find on there the story in writing, what happened between these two parties, and you'll be able to follow it written down as well as badly acted out. All credits, acknowledgements and all other materials are there on www.alistairhudson.com.